everyone, for this reflection I chose Eating Christmas in the Kalahari by Richard Borshay Lee. So I did not expect this to be as interesting as it was, but it turned out to be a really memorable story. It made me think differently about how people from different cultures can interpret the exact same situation in completely different ways. I'm also going to use ideas from our intercultural communication textbook because it helped me better understand how worldview affects the way that people interpret other cultures. What stood out to me the most is that the same behavior can mean completely different things depending on the culture. And in the article, Lee is living with the Kung Bushmen in the Kalahari Desert while doing his research. And before he leaves, he decides to buy a large ox for a Christmas feast as a way to thank the community for helping him through the year. He feels very confident that he had picked a great animal, and then he assumes that everyone will be excited and appreciative. But instead, the Kung keep telling him that the ox is too skinny and it's not worth eating. And at that point, that made Lee feel very embarrassed, and he started to worry that he had made a big mistake. But on Christmas Day, the ox turns out to be full of fat and provides more than enough meat for everyone. Then after the feast, the Kung explained that they purposely criticize successful hunters and generous gift givers so that they do not become prideful, and that their goal is to keep everyone equal and humble within their culture. And our textbook describes worldview as the belief and assumption people use to make sense of life. That idea really helped me understand what was happening in the article. And Lee interprets the Kung's comments based on what he's used to. Like in American culture, if someone gives a generous gift, people usually thank them and compliment them because that is what Lee expected. He assumes that the Kung are truly disappointed. But from the Kung's perspective, although their comment might have seemed harsh to him, it was a way of protecting the community. By downplaying success, they prevent arrogance and help make sure that no one sees themselves as better than anyone else. And at first, Lee thought his way of showing generosity was just the normal way people should respond, and that is a good example of ethnocentrism. So ethnocentrism means looking at another culture through your own standards. Our textbook points out that this can cause misunderstandings when we assume that our way is the only right way. And Lee expects people to openly thank him, but the Kung care more about humility than praise. And once he learns why they acted that way, he realizes they were not being rude at all. They were following an important tradition within their culture. And then this story really made me think about how often we assume that our own customs are universal. Like in the United States, praise and recognition are usually seen as positive, but to the Kung, that is completely different, and they show a completely different approach that is just as meaningful. Their tradition teaches that keeping people humble helps maintain equality and strong relationships. One tradition of my own that I can think of is celebrating birthdays with gifts, cake, and lots of attention focused on one person. To me, that feels completely normal and fun, but to someone from a different culture that values modesty and group identity, that might seem overly focused on one individual. And this reminded me that even everyday traditions can look very different depending on someone's worldview. A good takeaway for communicating with people from other cultures is to avoid making quick judgments and instead ask questions. So our textbook emphasizes the importance of humility and listening, and Lee did not understand what was happening until he asked the Kung why they criticized the ox. So once he listened to their perspective, the whole situation made sense. That example shows why curiosity and openness are so important when interacting with people from other cultures. I had a similar experience when I visited a friend's house and immediately offered to help clean up after dinner because in my family that is considered respectful, but at first their family seemed uncomfortable and told me to sit down and relax. And then later my friend explained to me that in her family, guests are expected to rest while the host takes care of everything. And just like in Lee's story, what seems confusing at first made sense once I understood what their cultural values were behind that. And then after choosing this article, what really stuck with me was that behavior only makes sense when you understand the worldview behind it. So Lee thought that he was being criticized, but he was actually being taught an important lesson about humility and equality. And both the article and our textbook helped me realize that effective intercultural communication requires an open mind and a willingness to question my own assumptions. So when we approach others with humility and respect, we are more likely to build understanding across cultures. Thank you for listening.